All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. It's always great when there's more people than expected. Couldn't have had better weather for it. We're just here rejecting the sun after begging for it. So I'm going to talk about a few of the different places that I found. A couple different abandoned things, cemeteries, old buildings, that sort of thing. I never really plan out too much what I'm going to say because I think that's a good reflection of the kind of exploring I do. For the last 16 and a half years now, since November 2007, I've kept a daily journal of my exploring and my adventures, so to speak. So every day I hit the road and I pick a direction, I go and explore. Sometimes I'm following like LiDAR imagery, looking for old foundations in the woods where you can see the square of where there used to be a building. Sometimes I'm hiking an abandoned road, or I'm following some lead to a cemetery. But I never plan that far ahead where I'm going to go. Sometimes it's 20 minutes before I leave the house. Sometimes I think about it the night before. So I always like to sort of speak on the fly because that's the same way that I like to explore. There's a very high failure rate with this kind of exploring. I might look for an old cemetery I've heard something about for several different trips. I might look for it off and on for months or years before I've actually found some of them, until I start wondering if they even exist to be found anymore. It's so easy to overlook something in the woods. You can walk right by it, you can be so close to it, and it'll be completely swallowed up by the brush. A good example is this first place here. Now, this is an old cannon battery near the mouth of the Annapolis Basin, so where the Bay of Fundy goes into the river, and it goes up into Annapolis Royal. And I'm going to read you what I wrote about actually in this book. I have this book of some abandoned buildings and other locations called "Don't Be Mad, Be Nomad." And this is what I wrote about it. Now, this was the Prince Regent Battery. There was two separate cannon batteries at the mouth of the Annapolis Basin, and one in Victoria Beach was removed at some point, and this one they really just forgot about. They let get overgrown, and the stands that the cannons were on rotted away, and they're left here in the brush. But if you came by here in the summer with all the leaves out, you could walk right past it and miss them, which is very common about a lot of the places I find. Even whole buildings that the trees grow over them enough that they block your view. So this is what's in the book about it. This site was only active for a decade at most. Mounted up with a blockhouse in 1812, protection from piracy carried out by the new United States. This was part of British North America then, still under threat from our neighbors to the south. But these guns were never needed or fired in battle, sitting silent as they still sit now, heavy weaponry long since gone to sleep. They were obsolete even then, marked for King George II, whose reign ended 52 years prior. While new ships and important ports bristled in honor of George III, this place was already seen as a secondary affair. 2 centuries later, no real threat has ever faced this gap in the mountain. Each cannon left the foundry with a slightly different weight, marked on the barrel. The middle one reads 41-210. That's hundredweight, quarter weight in pounds. Equals out to 4,658 pounds, small variance from the others. They remain in restless setting, sinking where they fell after their shelter rotted, lying over saltwater waves crashing, too solid to fade so fast. It's a long time to lie in state, like a saint or a regent under glass, displayed for the faithful subjects. Save these sit in open weather, seeing if the damage they suffer can match that which they were made to make. What could be more peaceful than a weapon returning its iron to the earth, like a soldier's musket rusting with his bones, or an axe head consumed by the roots of trees it might have felled? Take me slow and easy as the past. That's the weight marked on there. You know, when I was growing up, a lot of people, they rightly talked about my area, Annapolis County, as being sort of almost like a series of ghost towns. I mean, relative to the industry and activity that used to be there, we had taken quite a significant downturn from all the old factories and farms and fishing and so on. You know, but even that was in progress a long time previous. You know, when these cannons were placed in 1812, interest had already shifted significantly from the old capital of Annapolis Royal to Halifax. So this downturn had been in progress for a very long time, and certainly by the time I was born in 1987, it was the only version of my area that I knew. But I think what people missed out on growing up is that they saw a lot of what used to be, and you know, the lack of work and so on, and they considered that to be the surface level of all there really was. But in 2007, I took, my father used to race bicycles, and he had this rusty old 1977 Gitan Tour de France bike, this really nice bicycle. And he had taken it across Europe with my mother in '79 for their honeymoon, which was more his idea than hers. And when he came back, it was stored outside. It was always, you know, exposed to the weather. So in 2007, when I was 19, I had it fixed up. I replaced the rusty brakes and the little parts that had worn away. I took it up to this shop called Nos that no longer exists in Halifax, and they painted it and they re-chromed the forks. And so I fixed it all up. And I took it on this solo bike trip. Took the ferry up from Digby to St. John, and I biked 330 miles to the border, the whole state of Maine, and into New Hampshire. And when I came home from that trip that fall, I turned 20 on that trip, and that was sort of my goal. I wanted to make a solo road trip before I turned 20, and I turned 20 in this little, you know, one man, well, for me, more of like a 3/4 of a man tent, and camped out in Farmington, Maine, behind the narrow gauge theater. And I came home from that trip that fall, and I thought, you know, it was so funny that I'd been all through rural Maine. I'd you know, biked, and you really see the countryside when you're biking, when it takes, you know, days to do what you could drive in an hour. And I came home from that trip, and I realized that I barely knew my own surroundings. I thought, well, why is Maine more interesting than Nova Scotia? I mean, it's the same, essentially. It's very similar terrain and history. And I started exploring the area. I started my daily journal that November, which, you know, is not it's not a specific time. You know, my birthday's in August, and I didn't wait till the new year, but I thought if I start now, or when I have this sudden inclination to do it, then I can be sure that I won't put it off, forget about it. So it's like my years sort of start in November 10th or something, which, you know, has no significance to me, except that's when I started exploring. But I looked at all these places that I started to find, and I realized that what people missed as they grew up like I did and moved away, and I was one of the only ones from my generation that didn't move away, is that they never thought that there was something to find or explore, or some adventure to be had in the woods. They thought it's out there somewhere. People will look at my photos and they'll say, "Oh man, I wish I had places like this to find and explore." And they're talking to me from like Ontario or Maine or somewhere like that. And I think, well, there's no way that your woods isn't full of this sort of thing as well. Or people in Nova Scotia saying that to me as if they don't realize that I live here too. So as I started exploring, I realized that there is like an endless sort of adventure to be had. The same sort of thing that might draw you to visit a country in Europe, where like I've been to Greece and to Portugal, and there's all this history, and it's well documented. There's very little to find there, but what would you rather experience is to look at only the documented history, or to kick around in the woods and to find this sort of history that has been lost and forgotten that you can find for yourself? And that might not be appealing to everybody, but it certainly got me as excited as when I was a kid, and covering the walls of my bedroom with maps. And one of the things I thought about a lot in those days was that I wanted to explore, like in the stories that I read about it, like Lewis and Clark or Magellan or something, where you're discovering places all around the world, and of course they were mostly discovering places and then pretending that they weren't otherwise occupied in the first place. But once I got older and I realized all these places were mapped, they were all, you couldn't find a new island or a new mountain and all of that. But what had happened in places like Nova Scotia that had a peak of 100, 200 years ago, between then and now, is all of this forgotten history that you couldn't find it as if it was never existed. I mean, it's human history, and it's not like you can't dig up the pyramids again and so on, but you can find this history between now and 1800 or so where it's been overlooked. And sometimes I find history that maybe a lot of older folks would hardly consider history because it's in their lifetime. When I find like an old house from the 60s or 70s, like this one is a good example. In my area in the 1970s, up along the Bay Shore, there was a big influx of hippies. They were different backgrounds. Some of them were draft dodgers during the Vietnam War. Some of them were artists and other folks. They all sort of congregated along the Arlington Road area, which is sort of just above Bridgetown, over the valley of North Mountain. And they built a lot of unusually shaped places. There was one called the five-sided house, which is just like it sounds. It had 5 sides, but it had like a turret off to the side. There was one that they called Total Anarchy, just because they built it with no square or level. There was a geodesic dome, and then there was this one, which is shaped like sort of a coffin shape. And then there's like a coffin almost motif on the front of it. And people call this one the Shrine, and it's way off in the woods. You wouldn't be able to find it by accident at all. And trapezoid. That's the shape I'm thinking of. Back is flat. It's like a triangle with the front, with the top tip lip lopped off. So this is one of the sort of the lesser known places, and I wrote about this in this book as well. The Shrine is one of the only places where I knew the story before I saw it for myself. It's one of many structures built by North Mountain hippies in the 70s and 80s, constructed by a young couple, a place for practicing what they called isolation meditation in memory of their stillborn child. On the front end is this coffin motif, and at the peak behind that fallen tree, a tiny window with a tiny cross. I don't know how long they came here, maybe a matter of months or years, but in time they broke up and went their separate ways. Back down to the States, it said, Well, the story of a family that almost was but never will be stayed behind. Someone remembered them as Jim Russell and a woman named Nasha, but I can't speak for folks I've never met. Now I'm sure I've been coming longer here than they ever did, following up the memory of a child with no name. I tread again in knee-deep history, first across a field and then the forest. I've never worked so hard to make my way here, wading and swimming through the snow, lungs burning and heavy under a falling evening, but it'll never outweigh the morning. And this is inside. You can see the sort of little cross up there in the triangle, and the curtain's still hanging there, sort of a burlap over the glass. And it's a very small, narrow place. On the right, you can see it's looking forward, and then there's a reverse looking back to the little stove in the corner there. And a lot of the history I find, it sort of ranges. This is 70s, 80s history, which, again, well, some people that's hardly history. But, to me, whether I'm finding places that are 200 years old or, 30, 40 years old, that's the sort of stories that we build directly on. If we come from, say, somewhere that, like this mindset that right before us is the things that we just missed, like the songs, the music that were popular, the movies. It's like the photographs that I grew up seeing in my mother's photo albums. I remember being obsessed with these pictures that were from my older siblings' childhood, and my parents when they were first married. You see these reflections of the world that you just missed, and that's the part that you're kind of continuing on from a lot. I've never been very nostalgic about my own childhood. I'm the living representation of that. What I'm interested in is the part that came directly before me. I'm never going to be, sort of acting very nostalgic about the 1990s or whatever. People do that very quickly. I used to wonder how they did that, or why they did that. When I was a kid, people were talking about the 50s and the 60s. Their childhoods, is how wonderful it was. My grandparents would talk about the 30s and the 40s and so on. And I already see it now. People my age, mid 30s, they're talking about the 90s and the 2000s. These like rosy, wonderful times, and I think it's quite silly because I remember what they were like, and the fact that they're no better than now. It's just a slightly different world that we happen to inhabit, and of course I don't have long, deep roots in this country. I was the first generation born in Nova Scotia. My parents are from Cornwall, Ontario. And then I have grandparents before that, or great-grandparents, that are from the Netherlands and from Denmark. And the ones in the Netherlands, they lived through World War II, and my great-grandfather spent 9 months in a Nazi work camp. So to look at their lives and to say, that we imagine the past as being better, it's a sort of unbalanced perspective that I've never really been able to get my mind around. It's not about this time where the past used to be better. It's about stories, however you can gather them and tell them. And a good example of that is, actually I went for this one. So there was a time not that long ago that around a third of all children died before adulthood. Statistically, in Canada, it was the 1890s or so that if you had a child, 3 children, you'd lose one. About 30% of all children were lost. And it's gotten to a point now that you more or less expect that child mortality is going to be a rare occurrence. In fact, a few years ago in 2021, I had this woman who she hired me to take photos of her and her daughter at the funeral home in Kentville. Her daughter had died after a couple weeks, and she had some trouble finding someone who would take those pictures of her and her deceased child. And later I asked if I could share them online. A lot of people appreciated it, but in general, people had trouble relating because it's so rare of a thing now. Whereas 125 years ago, everybody you know would have lost a child. In fact, when I say to people, do you remember the child who died in Bridgetown when we were growing up? And it was it was one of the Chipman boys, and he died in an ATV accident. And he was a good hockey player. People knew him for that. People really liked him. But all I have to do is say, do you remember the child, the one who died? But if you had grown up in the 1890s instead of the 1990s, if you had known 100 kids, say, around, the local school running around, you might have known 30 kids who died. So that's kind of a perspective on how much has changed with, in terms of our ability to relate to the past. Now, this stone, or these collection of stones here, are all for one family, and that's a very common thing with the abandoned cemeteries that I find, is that you'll see these locations where the dead are mostly of one family. Sometimes you start having a couple other surnames appear if other families married in. But it's very common to have them at the back of the field, even in the side lawn. The assumption was that people had been in one place for generations, and before people came to Canada from Europe, it would be common to be settled in the same house in the same town for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now we would never want to bury our family members in the side yard, assuming that we'll sell the house and we'll move and it will keep changing again and again with each generation. But back then, they assumed things would continue the way they had. The family farm would be passed down and so on. But now all these family plots that I discovered, well, the land is owned by people that are completely unrelated to whoever it is that's buried there and have been for many years. And this is what I wrote. This is from my book, The Dead Die Twice. This is the Banks burial ground. Out of all the abandoned cemeteries I've found, this is the hardest to reach. Shielded by overgrown forest and a steep mountain descent, Banks burial ground was only in use from 1847 to 1878. In that time, it welcomed the family of Henry Banks, his wife Catherine, their daughters Annabelle, Eliza, Lila, Phoebe, and two named Henrietta. Standing just in the back is little Katie, daughter of Henry and his second wife Wilhelmina, named for the wife he lost years earlier. The only one with no stone is Henry himself. He died having buried all those before him, sunk in the sleepy plot. It would have stood clear on this small rise once upon a time, at the back of a field that farming forgot. When I first came here a couple winters ago, the stones were in an upended wreck, looking like so much rubble in the brush. I propped up what I could, leaned the big one on a tree to catch the light. That sinking sun gives no warmth at all now. Thin air like ice in my lungs, each breath a little burning. Only a hard hike in brought my body heat high enough to beat back the cold, moments before it started to bite again. I snapped some twigs, sifted powder into the carvings, brought the dead alive a little. That central memorial holds most of the names, monument to the brutality of diphtheria. The family obituary, written in 1859 when the first wave passed, reads in reference to Henry, Catherine, the wife of his youth and mother of his children, four of whom laid side by side in the dark and lonely grave, was by the same disease torn from his embrace, leaving behind her 3 little ones, youngest at her breast. 2 of a name is a common sight on old stones, in memory of siblings or parents lost. The first, Henrietta, lived from November 27th, 1845 to May 1847 and died when her mother was pregnant. The second, Henrietta, carried on the same name, born 6 months after her sister passed, just a day before her birthday, on November 26, 1847. Some believed it good luck to name after the dead, others thought the opposite. What it results for a time is overlapping history, some confusion looking back, a lack of distinction between them, a heartfelt hollowness, a name not used much these days. All sorrow seems endless when you're living through it, but here hides a reminder that it's one day gone for good. The second Henrietta lived a little longer than the first, nearly 12 in the end, before leaving her siblings and mother in 1859, sorry. The 2 Henriettas are together in death, like they never were in life, deep beneath the frozen ground, never apart again. So this, nope. Oh, that was it. So, what I find really compelling about a lot of these old plots and these old cemeteries is that people often think about, death as a morbid thing, which I think is a luxury that you're able to have when death doesn't surround you. And for me, I always thought that when we look at places on the news and we say, this place is having a war, or this place is having, certain rampant disease, and then when we have a lot of that ourselves, like happened in the last few years, we have a certain lack of understanding about what that experience can be like. We look at the loss of human life and think that it's normal that survival is expected, whereas for most of human history, survival was seen as more of a lucky occurrence. So I don't look at these places and think, oh, it's sad that all these people died. I think, well, it's a better context for being alive. If you're somebody like me that tends toward being more depressed or sort of less focused on the upside, at least, that you look at these places and people will try to impose that on you. It's like, oh, you're not upbeat. Well, look at you could have more reasons to be depressed, as if that's going to help you specifically. But I never thought that looking to a comparative context was a good way to become happy. I found a lot more happiness in being surrounded by the death itself, to not just think about the context, not read a book about how things used to be in history, but to actually sort of inhabit these places. Or it's like some people will say to me, do you ever feel haunted in these old places? And there's certainly, like, especially if you go when it's like almost evening to somewhere, or like an old building like that one that they called the Shrine. You go in there and it's dark and you've never been there before, and there's certainly this sort of spooky feeling to it. But I wouldn't say that I feel haunted so much in these places. It's more like I'm the one that's haunting them. I'm the sign of life in a place that's full of death. And I think a lot of people, they look at their lives almost like the opposite of that. They look at the world, they look at all of the people around them, They look at all the activity. They look at all the young people and they feel very old. They look at the changing technology and they start to feel disconnected. And you start to feel like you're the dead one in a world where everything is alive. And I would rather be the living one in a world where everything is dead. And I think that it has kind of changed a lot of my mindset toward how I gauge my own happiness, not in context of how happy other people are, but in context of how unhappy or unalive the dead themselves are. And so it's not something that I ever think is something that pulls me down. And I don't even think of these sorts of stories as something that is depressing. Like some people will look at the stories and they'll say, "Oh, it's so sad that so and so is forgotten, and these names, nobody knows who they are anymore." And I said, "Well, I've just remembered them. I've written about them. They aren't forgotten now. So if they were forgotten then I've sort of guaranteed, at least for a time, that they aren't forgotten. So it can never be sad that there's an abandoned cemetery in the woods, as long as it gets found again." It's like the title of the book, "The Dead Die Twice." What it refers to, of course, is the first death is the one we all experience, but the second death is when people forget our names. And they don't know who we are. They never say the name out loud. The written record of it disappears. And that's the second death that I think we're all sort of trying to prevent. Like somebody said to me about an old gravestone that was crumbling that I had dug up from the dirt, and I'd sort of exposed it to the light to be read and to be seen for many decades. And this one probably hadn't been seen for at least 60 years, because there was a man that had written down all the names he found at this cemetery. This was a Daniels family cemetery in the 1960s. He had written everything he found, but he didn't see this stone. So when I saw the edge of it and I dug it up, it must have been underground for at least since the 60s, maybe long before that. And they said to me, "Well, how do you know that they would want to be remembered and see and go through all this effort and drag up the history of them?" And I said that, to me, I think that there is no more primary thing than that. I think we only start accepting that we'd rather be forgotten once we get used to people forgetting about us. Like when you're a child, my earliest memory is laying in a crib and shouting or crying, trying to get someone to notice me. That's the earliest thing I remember. It's the most basic human thing. You want to be remembered. You don't want people to forget that you exist. Whether it's you're worried about your parents forgetting you as a baby, or you're worried about nobody loving you, and then as people become elderly, or if you start to have dementia, it becomes the full circle back to that. You want people to visit you. You don't want people to forget you. You don't want to forget yourself. And that's what drives me as a writer, and I think that's what subconsciously drives a lot of people. Just get scared of it because we don't think we deserve to be remembered, or we've tried to make people remember us and it didn't work. So I think that's what a lot of this comes back to, is that part of it's the history, but a big part of it is making sure that you're going to be part of the history yourself. I would get a gravestone more for people like me than the immediate family that I left behind. I would get the gravestone so somebody like me in 100 years could find a stone like that, and then they could become part of my history, and I become part of theirs, and so on. So that's sort of a meandering series of thoughts. And yeah, I appreciate you coming out and listening, and I'd love to answer questions if anybody has any. Yes.
When you've been sharing these pictures and stories with us, really appreciate that. It made me think of something that people such as yourself are, as we can put it, a dying breed. Because of, like, I was just thinking about cremation, and I was thinking about how history is going like up in smoke, you know, like, where people such as yourself in the next, 20, 50, 70, 100 years time from now, there's so much, people don't have as many gravestones, nowadays, and I just was wondering if you thought about any of that.
Well, I don't think I mind the idea of cremation, so to speak. I mean, my grandfather was cremated, but he has a gravestone. So I think that cremation doesn't need to change the history. In fact, a lot of the gravestones I find, I know are not where the bodies are, because there were family plots that were moved, but they definitely didn't dig the bones up. They just moved the stones. So I don't think that one necessarily has to lead to the other. It's also important to remember that the vast majority of people historically didn't have gravestones either. Many, they only had wooden crosses. They couldn't afford a stone, or there are many stones that wore away. Like a lot of limestone markers, which is what these are, despite how discolored they are, they're limestone. Limestone it ranges roughly from chalk to marble, and there are ones I find that are much too chalky and they've crumbled. And there are slate markers, which tend to shatter and almost like shards of glass. And then there are sandstone markers, which usually stay intact, but they lose the face because it's a sedimentary stone. They'll lose the face, so you'll have this nice stone, but there won't be anything on it anymore. Yeah, I've found that we tend to have this impression that people from years ago, they thought more about the past and more about the memory and so on of people. But in my experience, people from the past, they often didn't have, unless they were rich. It was more common that they didn't feel almost like they could afford to think about the past. They were too engaged in trying to survive in the present, so they would want to remember their dead, but that wouldn't last for more than a generation or two. There are many cemeteries that I find that were purposefully destroyed. They were plowed over, and they weren't done by. They were done by my grandparents, my parents' generation, even that sort of age group, where people said, "Well, nobody cares anymore. Their time is gone." So I think now people have this luxury. They have the time. They have the means to research their family history, to care about, somebody like me, who has time, who has, to have almost like a career that's based around exploring these places and recording them, is something that would have been much less likely to have existed years ago. So if anything, I think that the future means that there'll be more and more people who want to connect to their past or their family's past, rather than less people. Of course, I can't predict the future, but that's my impression. Yeah, now that it's because it's easier to get into it, and then as I pass that information on, like I'll say to people, like I put out this guidebook of called the Dead Center, and it's every cemetery I found in Annapolis County, and there are 144 in the book, and about 50 of them are abandoned. So you got about a third of the cemeteries that are overgrown or abandoned and forgotten in some way. But in the book, I have GPS coordinates for all of them. So whereas I spend sometimes months looking for these places, everybody now, and I put the information on places like Find a Grave and other places online, so people will be able to find these places now. So they've moved from something that required a lot of effort to track down, a lot of personal knowledge, to now places that anybody can find, which I think, you know, bodes well for people in the future, that the barrier to entry is so much lower than it was even for me a few years ago. And you know, and GPS coordinates are more of a permanent thing than, you know, it's out back of the old farm, which has been torn down, turn left of the old tree, which has fallen down, and so on. Or like people in my area like to say, you know, it's out by the old Zellers. So the old Zellers is the Walmart now, but instead of saying it's out by the Walmart, we'll say it's by the old Zellers. But with GPS coordinates, just a series of numbers anybody can put into Google Maps or put into their phone, and it'll take you right there. And yeah, that makes things a lot easier than it was for me to do it. Any other questions?
You did a couple of posts on your Facebook page about old foundations.
Yes.
And I was very intrigued by that. Have you any plans or any thought of compiling?
I thought about it. I'm actually, I haven't announced it yet, but Nimbus Publishing that put out my cemetery book, they have, they actually are going to be signing me up doing a book about abandoned roads. And that gives me a bit of a chance to talk about some of the foundations, because a lot of them are along abandoned roads. But it's something I've only just started researching. In 2019, they finished the LiDAR mapping, which if you don't know, LiDAR is sort of like radar mapping that was done by helicopter, and they mapped the entire surface of Nova Scotia in 2019. And it's calibrated to see through anything except the contours of the land. So you'll see no buildings on it, you'll see no bridges, even the bridges will have the abutments and they'll just disappear in the middle. But you can use the imagery to see the outlines of things that have disturbed the ground. So an old cellar foundation where the house is long gone, you'll see a sort of a square shadowed mark. And I've been using that to find a lot of old foundations. And then I can use other maps that I have from the 1800s to see who actually had the house, which is, it's really interesting to be able to connect that history. Some of these abandoned roads that I hike, they might have you know, 3 or 4 or as many as 6 or 8 foundations along them. So there's a lot of history that's in the woods, whether it's an old building that's standing, foundation, cemetery, yeah, basically whatever people leave behind. But yeah, they're really interesting to find the old foundations, because they you know, they remain almost like they were when people placed them. They're dry stacked stones, so you can see this direct reflection of when they dug the hole and built them up.
It's interesting how small in dimension they are, and these were large families.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's a slight optical illusion too. It's a strange. A space can look a lot smaller without a building actually surrounding it. But yeah, in general, they were pretty small. Yeah, they, you know, we get used to having so much space now, but it's. You know, my bedroom would be half a house in those days. Anyone else?
Is that LiDAR mapping online?
Yeah, it's a little confusing to use. You have to like, I think it's called, I think if you search data locator, something along those lines, you have to like turn off the index setting and then turn on something called hill shade. It's more of a technical tool. I'm not even sure they expect random members of the public like me to have found it.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, you have to turn a couple settings on the sidebar and figure that out in order to use it. But it is publicly available,
It is available.
which is nice. Hopefully they don't take it off while I'm still in the middle of using it.
So are you letting people like your mom or someone know that you're going out way out? Just I'm going out and don't know where I'm going, but
No, I
you'll be
mean
missed.
generally I barely know where I'm going. So Yeah, no, I mean, I've been exploring long enough to kind of, you think about, not taking unnecessary risks and so on. I mean, I think everything, exploring the woods with a certain amount of risk. And, I think my biggest concerns would be, like breaking an ankle or, some people ask me about wildlife, and honestly, I'm not too concerned. We don't have any poisonous snakes. The only coyote attacks I've heard about is from joggers. I always tell people as much as I have a chance that you really have to not run in the woods because only prey runs in the woods, and if you run, it looks like you want to be chased. And like the woman, everybody knows about the woman who was killed by coyotes in Cape Breton. She was jogging, and people will think that just because it's a nice trail in the woods, they can jog on it, and they'll safely, in terms of like tripping and falling, they can jog, but they're in the wild territory, and then the coyotes, they might well chase you. And I think she was the only one who was killed, but other people have been chased, and almost always people who were running or jogging. I tend to go in places that are so rough that I would be seriously risking my life just from tripping, I think. So I'm not moving very quickly. I came across black bears a few times. It's funny, in one year, I think it was 2018. I was up close to black bears 3 occasions. One was out in Springfield, off Highway 10. I was hiking, it was just like feeding in the brush, and I was as close as you are to me. But yeah, about that. It looked up and it startled and it ran off. Another time was down the valley in Moshel. I was walking along the path. It's an abandoned road called Harris Road, and I just rounded a corner and I thought, okay, I got far enough here. I'm gonna turn around. And the second I turned around, a bear had probably thought, oh, he's passed, I'll walk by. So I turned around and we came face to face. We both sort of jumped and he ran off. There's never been a documented black bear attack in Nova Scotia. There's been a couple cases where people have said, they've been followed by one, or there's been sort of some aggression. Maybe there was cubs around as well. But there's never been an actual documented attack, certainly never a killing. Black bears are pretty skittish, and so I'm not terribly worried about them. I'm more worried about coyotes, to be honest. But yeah, if you you stay away from dens and cubs and you don't go jogging, I think that your risk is a little bit more up to you. But yeah, people don't always know where I am. But fortunately, I always make sure that I know where I am.
Have you ever gone up into the Cape Breton Highlands to do research and do your walking and whatnot?
I would like to. It's a little out of my way. I was on actually a vacation, more of the standard, follow the road vacation with my wife there in September. Most of the exploring I've done, there's a couple locations in the cemetery book, The Dead Die Twice in Cape Breton, one in the Points, and another in Marshes, so more down around Bredor. I found another place that I didn't put in the book, near Sydney. But yeah, there is a lot to explore out there, but it's more like if I'm working on a book and I have a couple leads, and my budget is usually like, stay at a hotel 2 to 3 nights, and you better, go to as many places as possible, and I don't include the ones that I might not find because I only have so much time on the road. But Cape Breton's almost like a whole world unto itself. If I made it through the mainland and got into Cape Breton, I often say that Nova Scotia is a really great place for someone like me to explore if you're looking to kind of get to know a whole province. Because say if I was exploring Ontario, I would never be done in my lifetime. If I was exploring PEI, I would probably be almost done about now after 16 years. But Nova Scotia is just enough that you can kind of do it your entire life and never be done, but also kind of get a good overall picture of it. Like, I feel like my stomping grounds, which is pretty much Digby, Kings, Annapolis County, I feel like I'm almost done. Well, I say that, but you know, I only started finding how many abandoned cemeteries there were in 2020, and I thought I was almost done then. And I've been spending a lot of time looking for abandoned foundations, and I mapped all these abandoned roads. I still find things all the time. I still got leads to follow. When you really start digging into the woods, you don't run out very quickly. But yeah, as I think of a new area, I think, you know, I could spend 10 years in any county or whatever. And I've been thinking about moving a little, you know, more central to eastern, just because these road trips, you know, you want to go farther, but you don't want to spend 2 hours driving just to start on hiking somewhere. But yeah, Cape Breton would occupy a lot of time.
Could you share with us about your other guidebook that you have?
Yeah, well, I have 2 guidebooks here. The Dead Die Twice, Annapolis County Cemeteries. And then I put together this one called Desperate Passages. And this is every abandoned road that I found, everyone that's still a public right of way, so to speak. Well, it's owned by the government still. And that's every abandoned road that I've found and mapped in Annapolis, Digby, and Kings County. And a lot of those are mountain roads. Really anything that the more erosion it got, the more maintenance it needed, the more likely it was to be maintained or to be abandoned. So yeah, that's taken me about a decade, really. I started hiking them a lot in 2014. And these roads are great because if you spent any amount of time in the woods around here, that we have a long history of clear cutting, which means that as soon as you get off into a lot of the woods, it's a real headache. You're pushing through a lot of brush, a lot of young growth, but these roads, they'll get you into the woods so much more. They're sometimes the only way that I would want to get into some of the brush. So yeah, I love being able to include these and talk about them. And I have a website called abandonedroadsns.com, and in that, on the website, I have the map of all the roads that I've done. I've done some down here in Lunenburg County, and mostly closer to home. But as I go through these roads, the more people that use them, the more guarantee that they won't be overgrown and completely lost. Because what's very common is that people will stop using them, and then they'll get overgrown, and the trees will fall across. And maybe 1 out of every 10 abandoned roads that I go looking for, like, it's on the map, I see it on all the property records, I know where it's supposed to be. I get there, it's just a wall of brush, like it never existed. So it's great to see them still kept open, even in a minimal sort of way. Some people that really like hiking, like I just hike, I don't have an ATV. Some people like horses and so on. But some people, they seem to have a problem with the off-roaders. And what I tell everybody about that is they're the only guys out there with a chainsaw.
Yeah.
I certainly am not going to hike with a chainsaw. So, it's true that some off-roaders, they just love making the mud holes more and more muddy. They are the only ones that keep abandoned roads open. I can break some branches and throw some, deadfall out of the way, but that's about it.
I think that's changed quite a bit too over the years.
Yeah.
Because we do a lot of off-roading.
Yeah.
And we've seen just the change. I'm from here, but we were out in BC where people complain about the off-roaders, but they're the ones going back there hauling the abandoned cars, all the garbage out.
Yeah.
And keeping the trails open. And
it's sort of a funny middle ground with the abandoned roads, because there are maintained trail systems, of course, but a lot of these abandoned roads, they aren't, no organization maintains them. Yeah. So what will happen is that they'll be kept up by really just one guy. Yeah. And you always know when you go back and that guy has moved away, because things have started being left again. Yeah. So some of them do intersect with say off-road systems, or at least for a little bit, as they go a different way. But a lot of the times I'm finding ones that are not terribly long, so they're not too attractive to off-roading because say they're only a kilometer or two. And
Yeah.
if they don't connect to another thing, they can't they can't sort of puzzle their way into an overall system.
Yeah.
So a lot of them, they're really just up to whatever the two guys on that road like to do. So it varies quite a lot, but I love to tell people about them because, they're great as something that is free for everybody to use. And that is something that there really isn't enough of in the woods. I've had a few cases where locals, somebody with a neighboring land, they try to block it off. They try to say it's their road, no one can use it. And it's important to push back against that. Even with the cemeteries and Monuments Protection Act is from 1998. And that was enacted to ensure that everybody can legally visit any cemetery. You can cross the woods, you can get through wherever you want to get to it. Nobody can legally stop you from doing that. And there are people who don't like to hear that. We live in a part of the world that is much more restrictive to who can go where. If you look at European countries or in the UK, they have a lot more. In the UK, it's referred to as a right to ramble. Which is you can basically go anywhere that's undeveloped as long as you're just going. Not necessarily right to hunt, not necessarily right to build anything or to cut the person's trees down, but you can go in the woods if the woods are there to go in. And people will try to tell you here that we don't have that. That's not actually true. You can follow streams, you can walk through most woods as long as it's not posted every so many meters. I think it's important that landowners be more educated, that they can't actually stop people as much as they think they can. And I don't believe in vandalism or doing anything necessarily illegal, but it's not illegal to just walk in the woods in most situations. So not something that a lot of people are aware of. I've had a lot of angry people try to tell me that you can't go here or there, and it's usually not true.
What's the oldest site that you found, and have you found anything on the Acadians being up in that area?
Well, the interesting thing about the Acadians is they didn't tend toward using gravestones. They used crosses, and they were almost all long lost, of course. So the Acadian era tends to not be represented almost at all. The earliest stones that I tend to find, earliest gravestones, and that's the earliest of all things, because nothing survives nearly as long as the gravestones, except, well, those cannons, but I don't find a lot of cannons in the woods. The gravestones tend to stop around the 1790s. So we're talking like the earliest loyalists, the folks that came here after the American Revolution and then died in the first decade or two. Those tend to be the first. Some are children, some are people who came here already older and so on. The oldest I've found, I think, is 1787. I forget the name right now, but it's at a little roadside cemetery in Belle Isle between Bridgetown and Annapolis Royal. So 1790s usually is about the earliest that I'll find. That tends to be kind of the stopping point. Anything earlier, if it survived, would be a lot harder to identify. It'd be more of an archaeologist's job. A pile of stones, rocks arranged in a certain way. And it's interesting because it makes a lot of the history that I find exist in a pocket that doesn't intersect with a lot of what the historians would normally be focused on. Like a good example is in the 1930s, they rebuilt the habitation at Port Royal, which was the earliest permanent settlement of Europeans, of the French. And they rebuilt it, and I grew up, visiting it. That's what people were talking about then, the Acadian history, the early loyalists. Fast forward almost a century, and that's still all they're talking about. And with good reason. There's a lot to find. There's a lot to dig back, and the paper history and the physical history, things to dig up, things to use ground penetrating radar and so on. And every once in a while they do skip forward a bit. They talk about one of the sort of tragedies that we try to forget. One of them I talk about is a woman who was assaulted and got pregnant at the Marshalltown poorhouse, and her child was buried, her stillborn child. I talk about that in my cemetery book. So the poor farms people have talked about because for years people try to avoid talking about it. Then of course the residential schools that people have talked about. So that's a more recent history. It goes back, but it also goes forward a lot more than people would like to admit. Like I said to my parents, when you were a child, when you were growing up, people were still being sent away to the residential schools, and that is a perspective I think that not everybody has. But by and large, historians skip over the last couple centuries. But while they do that, all these places that I discover, if I wasn't finding them, they wouldn't last long enough for the historians to find them. Or like the old churches I photograph or whatever, churches that were built, say, the turn of the century, and then they were abandoned by like the 90s. If something doesn't become old enough, it never becomes a historic property. We lost a lot of the 20th century because we had such an economic downturn that things that were built in the early 1900s were being abandoned by the 80s and 90s because things were so bad in the rural areas. So a lot of these places that I photograph, whether it's an old fishing wharf, a church, gravestones, a lot of these places, I in a lot of cases, I know that I'm the only one recording that history because by the time it gets on the radar, a lot of sort of proper historians, because I'm more of an artist than a historian. By the time it gets on their radar, it will be lost. The stone will have shattered. The building will be a pile of rubble. And so on. That's me meandering way past your question, but yes. Anyone else?
Yeah, so I want to make a quick point, I guess, it's just an observation. So I'm not from here at all, I'm from rural Maryland. So you're in this
yes.
weird spot where north of you in Pennsylvania, they preserve a lot of historic buildings. They don't necessarily become abandoned, they just become preserved. So at least they exist and they put them in a historical context, a museum context, and used to spend a lot of time exploring that. And then of course Baltimore City has like a lot of abandoned buildings and things like that, and a lot of abandoned histories, but without a lot of information. And you just sort of go back and ask your grandparents, what was this section like, or what was this place, and they could tell you a bit. But my friends and I trying to explore our little rural community was really tricky because down in like northern Maryland, and nowadays I attribute it to development, but I'm talking when we were kids and teenagers, it's almost if you found a place, you had to hurry up and take a picture right then and there, or it was just gonna be torn down.
Yeah.
And then it was like it never existed, and there was no information, and I feel like a lot of things weren't logged. So then fast forward, I marry a Nova Scotian guy, and I'm just completely flabbergasted, honestly, with how many abandoned communities there are here.
Mm-hmm.
And how it's almost, my estimation is that I guess nature was just allowed to swallow it into the forest. Versus other places, I guess that just didn't get to happen.
Well, we're more sparsely populated than Maryland for sure. That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
Most of the population rings the ocean. It's a very maritime focused community. When I get into the central province, there's actually a lot less history overall to find in the middle of the province because there was never really as much in the first place. There are certain logging communities that remain. There was one near me called Conquerall. There was one called Roxbury. A lot of people know about Roxbury. That was one of the biggest ones. And these satellite communities were built because in the early days when trees were being cut down, they only had the horses to haul them out, so they would have the sawmills to cut them down to boards to make them more transportable. So these communities existed in a time before modern trucking, simply to log farther out, whereas in somewhere like Maryland, which had more of a interconnected population grid and road system, that wasn't as necessary. But I've seen a lot of places torn down. That does happen a lot. Every once in a while, some idiot decides he wants to burn 3 or 4 down. That's happened too. But as I've gotten more and more onto the back trails and into the woods, I find places that are so little known that they're more likely to fall down before they get torn down. If you go near to the city or you go in areas that are more populated, it's more about land demand. Is that if somebody wants the land, they're going to tear down the house to build on it. In terms of like the historic value, what happens a lot of the time for me is that these places will be, they'll be so far gone by the time I found them that any real preservation is next to impossible. So I look at the preservation that I'm doing more in terms of I'll take the pictures and I'll write whatever oral history, whatever people will tell me, and that will be kind of the ongoing history. People who live through it, say at the schoolhouse they remember going to that closed in the 1960s, they tend to take it a lot more personally than I would. I have no personal connection to it. I think in a lot of times I'm happy to just record it and remember it. We sort of signed up for a less extensive history just by how we built with the available materials. I noticed when I went to, say, Greece and Portugal that they use more stone. Well, for one thing, in Greece there's a lot less trees, but because we build out of wood more, it was always going to be a more tenuous sort of history in the first place. So I don't necessarily expect the things to last forever. My focus is just making sure that they're remembered, even if they're not there. I look at houses a lot like people sometimes. I mean, certainly the people are never going to last forever. So if I'm writing about a person, I look at the buildings the same. If the building goes, I don't think of it as much of a tragedy as some people might, because you can still remember it the same as you would a person who died. So I think that's just my perspective. I'm all for preserving an old building, though. If anybody wants to do it, it's great. I don't know the first thing about carpentry. So. All right, is that everybody? Well, thanks a lot for coming out. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's great to do something in the middle of the winter. There's more people than I even expected, so that's great. Yeah, it's we couldn't have better weather, really. So thanks a lot, and yeah, I got several books. I've got if anybody wants them, you can pay with cash or you transfer on your phone if you don't have cash on you. I've got several things. I got a book of abandoned cemeteries, one that's just about children's graves, some poetry, some guidebooks. I got these 3 that are sort of more like coffee table type photography books, you know, if you want something a little fancier as a gift maybe. All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.